Hello, welcome to the Witness History podcast from the BBC World Service with me, Rebecca Kesby. And today we journey to Africa and the Indian Ocean to the sun-drenched archipelago of Zanzibar just off the coast of Tanzania. It's known for its spices and eclectic mix of cultures, but in 1964 it was the scene of a bloody revolution, just 1 month after gaining its independence.
It was a melting pot. People were from different backgrounds, from Africa, from the Middle East, from Asia, and as far as China, and also Portuguese. But they made up Zanzibari culture. It's very unique, and Zanzibaris are jealously proud of it.
Ahmed Rajab was an 18-year-old student when Zanzibar gained full independence in December 1963. It had been a British protectorate and effectively under its sprawling colonial influence since the 1890s, even though Arab sultans had held power locally. At independence, it became a constitutional monarchy under the Sultan Jamshid bin Abdullah.
Your Highness, I have great pleasure in presenting to you a copy of the Act of the British Parliament which recognises Zanzibar as an independent state within the Commonwealth.
Ahmed remembers it as an exciting time when Zanzibaris were looking to the future.
Oh, people were jubilant. So it was an exciting moment. Of course, there were differences, political differences, but there was a sense of hope.
But that unity of purpose was short-lived. In the early hours of the 12th of January 1964, 1 month after independence, a group of armed men began what would become known as the Zanzibar Revolution.
It was very early in the morning, just after dawn prayers, when we started hearing staccato of guns. I came out of the house and saw people discussing, what is that? It was just a sense of fear and people were worried.
What Ahmed didn't know was that by the time he heard that gunfire, a band of a few hundred revolutionaries had already attacked the main police barracks, taken over the radio station, and deposed the Sultan and his government. But when the announcement was made over the airwaves some hours later, it sounded, well, foreign.
Everybody was glued to the radio when this voice, which sounded of a mainlander, broke the airwaves of the Zanzibar broadcaster, the voice of Zanzibar, and said that the government was overthrown and there's a new government. It was a bit frightening.
So they sounded like a mainlander from somewhere in Africa. Was this voice speaking in the local language Kiswahili?
It was in Kiswahili, but the accent was not quite Zanzibari, you see. And that brought fear to most of the people, actually.
The voice belonged to one John Okello, originally from Uganda and not a native Kiswahili speaker.
John Okello, and he is not a Zanzibari at all. He has been issuing orders to the people over Radio Zanzibar all day. If anybody disobeys my orders, I will take action 88 times stronger than before, he said, as a warning to the people to do as they were told.
John Okello had moved to Zanzibar for work in the late 50s. Unlike the majority of locals who were Muslim, he was a Christian, but in spite of having no real roots in Zanzibar, his charisma and energy earned him a following amongst some of the most disaffected on the islands.
This was John Okello, but that time we did not even know how he looked like, just the voice. It's difficult to situate him in the Zanzibar Revolution because there's a lot of rewriting of history. Everybody has got their opinion. The memories are selective and unreliable in some parts. What we know is that the Zanzibaris who are in the plot found it convenient to use Okello because of his personality, because of his accent, because some of them were fearful that if they had taken to the airwaves, they would be recognized, and if anything went wrong, they would have faced the consequences. But he had some charisma, of course, and he had that following. They were mostly riffraffs, actually, of society, people who are dropouts.
His increasingly aggressive language on the radio was mirrored by grotesque violence across Zanzibar, including gang rapes and castrations.
Most of the killings took place within the first 72 maybe hours or so, 2-3 days. Terrible. And there were rapes, there were killings. People were thrown in cisterns horrible things that were never witnessed before on the islands, on that scale, mass scale,
So you were in Stone Town in the big urban area, but some of your family, I think, were on a different island.
My thoughts were on my mother and my sister were there in Pemba because we've had rumors of these atrocities. There were no mobile phones, even telephones. It was difficult to get through. So it was a time of intense anxiety, to say the least.
To governments overseas, it looked like any other leftist uprising. Some called Zanzibar Africa's Cuba, but whatever the official political rhetoric, there was an underlying ethnic element to the violence.
It certainly was not a typical Marxist revolution. It was not, because the people who made the revolution were no Marxists, you see. Mainly it was racially motivated. The targets were people of Arab or Asian origin. They are not exclusively the victims, but the majority of them are. It was humiliating people of a particular ethnicity, and some people termed them genocidal.
The cultural melting pot that Ahmed referred to earlier did have some tensions. Zanzibar's rich history was complicated, including by the legacy of several periods of foreign rule. For centuries it was a trading hub, not only for spices, ivory, precious metals and gems, but also for slaves. Tens of thousands of people were trafficked through Zanzibar from mainland Africa, often by merchants and sultans from the Arab Peninsula. Even though slavery had been abolished in the 1870s, it was just about within living memory, and many black Zanzibaris felt a culture of racism persisted.
I mean, of course, there were some prejudices in Zanzibar, but to call that or to try to portray that as institutional racism is being dishonest, I think.
But there was a feeling that people of Asian or Arab descent were the landowning classes, privileged because of the wealth of their ancestors, and that black Zanzibaris were being mistreated.
I think it was misinformed interpretation. Most of the people who had land had only plots of land, and they worked as bus drivers, they worked as taxi drivers, they were menial laborers as well. So it would be wrong to ascribe to all the Arabs as being of the landed class or capitalists or the bourgeoisie. It was far from that in reality.
And your own family was at risk.
Yes, because my parents came from the Comoro Islands, and they were put in the same category as the Arab. A number of them were also victims of the revolution. An uncle was imprisoned, and I know quite a few who also suffered during the first few days of the events.
Ahmed, all this happened just 1 month after the great fanfare of independence, when the British handed over power to the Sultan and his coalition government. Did the years of colonialism compound some of the simmering resentment between the different communities?
The British were there for 70 years. During that time, I think they fostered these divisions by categorizing people in racial terms, and also by trying to portray Zanzibar as an Arab state, which was not, and by being seen to favor a certain group.
Those few hours of January the 12th, 1964, changed the course of Zanzibar's history. It's not known exactly how many were killed. Some report hundreds, some say thousands. Rumours still persist as to exactly who or what was behind it, but in the weeks that followed the uprising, a revolutionary council was formed. It banished John Okello from the islands, and nobody knows what became of him. One story claims he returned to Uganda and was eventually killed by Idi Amin. Within weeks, the Revolutionary Council of Zanzibar struck a deal with its mainland neighbour, Tanganyika, to form a new country, Tanzania. But some Zanzibaris believe the union meant losing the chance of real independence, and the debate about whether that was a good decision persists to this day.
Yes, by no means. It's not over at all. People are still talking about what has happened, what could have prevented it, why was it necessary to have the bloodshed, because they feel that their sovereignty has been eroded, their identity has been lost, I'm afraid to say.
And how do you identify yourself? As a Tanzanian or Zanzibari?
I've always, because when I was born there was no Tanzania, and I've always found it strange to call myself Tanzanian, to be honest. Zanzibar still in the background of my mind all the time. You dream of Zanzibar, you wake up thinking of it. I've always described myself as Zanzibari first.
Academic and journalist Ahmed Rajab. He went on to work for the UN, the BBC and several international magazines. He was speaking to me, Rebecca Kesby, for this Witness History podcast from the BBC World Service.